Not complicated. No, not at all. Not at all.
I used to work in a
We're back in session. I want to make one update for the agenda. So the public health and safety, which is item J, and item K, comparative benchmarking with other municipalities, that is removed for tonight or this evening, and we'll pick that up at the next work session next week, right? Thursday. Okay. All right. With that, continue on.
Thank you. So we were looking at, while we had a brief break, we were looking at the slides, and not sure how it happened, but our water capacity section got moved a bit further down behind some other sections when it absolutely should be right behind water consumption, so we can go right into that and kind of address any other questions and kind of wrap up water altogether. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump ahead to the capacity regulatory requirements for water and Apex. Jonathan Jacobs will come up and speak to that, and then we'll go back to the other sections as well. Thank you.
All right. Good evening, Mayor, Town Council, and Planning Board. My name is Jonathan Jacobs. I'm the Water Resource Director here in Apex. Many of you are going to know a lot of the information I'm going to share, but it's also, this is probably the first time I think I've met the Planning Board, so it'll be new information for you. And then it's a lot of numbers and data, so feel free to come at me with some questions. I've been jotting down notes as y'all have been asking questions to make sure I can try to have the best information possible for you. So from my perspective, water is probably the most impactful part of a data center process. And so I thought it would be helpful to go through the facilities that we either wholly own or co-own with the town of Cary to give you an idea of our overall capacity, kind of our average flow now. And I'll kind of define what some of these mean, and then what our capacities look like, and then what expansion of these facilities looks like in our long-range planning efforts. So I'm going to start with water treatment. The Cary Apex Water Treatment Facility is located on Wimberley Road, if you didn't know that. The total facility capacity is 56 million gallons per day. So you'll see MGD a lot through this process. That's million gallons per day. The Apex capacity of that, we own 23% of that facility, so 12.88 million gallons per day of that 56 million gallon per day facility. Our average daily flow for 2025 was about just over 5 million gallons per day. So that was 5.05 or 39% of our capacity. And then our max day demand for 2025 was 6.9 million gallons per day. So what does that mean? So average daily flow is the average flow. So if I were to give you a graph of January to December of 2025, that average flow is the average of all those months put together. And then the max day is the highest day that we had throughout the year. So that highest day, and we track that on a 12-month rolling average. So that highest day in the last 12 months, or in 2025, was 6.9 million gallons per day. And I want to say that was in July. So July is usually one of the hotter months. We have a lot of irrigation in Apex, and so that's typically when we see the highest demand in our water flow. So to give you perspective, Bruce showed you a chart earlier comparing water use by type, and we used an example of 1.5 million gallons per day in that. So for purposes of just discussion tonight, I'm going to continue with the 1.5. That's an example figure, so I don't want to latch on to that number. But so if you were to look at our average daily flow, that would jump, from 5.05 in 2025 to 6.5, pretty much. I won't say overnight, because the site would have a build out period, but that's a pretty big impact at one time to our system. So. And then before I go into our storage capacities, we have our raw water intake at Jordan Lake. So if you go over the bridge on 64 going west, you can look to the right, and that's where our intake is, right there, going towards Pittsboro. We also co-own that with Cary. 23% kind of carries through all that transmission infrastructure. So we have 10.6 million gallon per day capacity at that raw water intake, and our average all water demand in 2025 was 5.83 million gallons per day. So a couple of things I want to say there. So our average daily flow, that's what we call finished water. That's the water that's going through the distribution network. That's what you get when you turn your sink on at your home, flush your toilet, or fill up your water bottle. Raw water is the lake water. So that's literally raw water. It's untreated. And that travels about 4 miles east along 64 through 3 different pipes. And that goes to that facility on Wimberley Road. All right, so water storage. So in Apex, we're proud of our tanks. It's like on everything we have. We repainted 2 of them this year. Very proud of those. And we currently have 3 tanks. So we've got one on Hunter Street, Mason Street, and Tingen Road, and they have various capacities, with Hunter Street being 500,000 gallons per day, Mason Street being 1, and Tingen Road being 1.5. And then, so that gives us a total available storage of 3 million gallons per day. So what does that mean? So to maintain water pressure, that was one of the questions that was brought up earlier, and maintain fire flow, emergency supply, and things like that, we are required to keep half of our average daily usage in the air, in storage. It doesn't have to be in the air, but in storage. We prefer elevated storage. It prevents us from having multiple pressure zones in our network. So every property in Apex is on the same pressure zone. That does not mean that pressure is equal across town. I want to clarify that statement. But most of our pressure in town is pretty great. A lot of people don't notice that they have what's called a pressure reducing valve on their home. So what you're getting in your sink is a significantly reduced amount of pressure than what's actually through the distribution network. And our lowest pressure is generally downtown, which is where all of our tanks are. The closer you are to the tank is generally the lowest point of pressure. So, and then my other point of clarification there is we have a tank at Pleasant Park under construction, so that'll give us another 1.5 million gallons per day, 1.5 million gallons per day of storage, and we expect that to go online later this year in 2026. So regulatory requirements about water storage. So I mentioned a minute ago, we are required at a minimum to have half of our average daily flow. So again, that was in 2025, that was 5.05 million gallons per day. Our required storage was 2.5. We currently have 3. So that's what triggered, we were getting close to that number. So that's what triggered us to start construction and planning for another tank, so that 4th tank. And so towards the end of this year, we'll have a total available storage of 4.5, which will get us up to allow us to have an average daily flow of 9 million gallons per day. I want to clarify, and that's why I put it in capital bold letters, that's a minimum requirement. So that's not necessarily what our goal is, what we strive to do. We want to have as much storage as possible in the event of a significant catastrophe, emergency, and things like that, or if that water plant were to go offline for a period of time or anything like that, to help stabilize our operations and make sure that we keep water in the pipe. You want water in the pipe, that way the water quality, the integrity of that water maintains, because as soon as a water pipe is empty, that's when you get the boil water advisory, things like that, to make sure that we're protecting the safety of our water. So let's see, and then we're planning on a 5th tank. It's currently programmed in our CIP for FY 28 and 29, which would be likely another 1 million to 1.5 million gallons of capacity in the air there.
What's clear well storage?
Oh, yes. So clear well storage. So at the Cary Apex water treatment plant, there is 8 million gallons of what's called clear well storage. So that's basically ground level storage of finished water at the facility. And we also own 23% of that. So that's 1.84 million gallons per day of storage. So we talk about elevated storage. That's what maintains the pressure and things like that. But we also have that additional storage at the facility in the event of some catastrophe or something of that nature.
Disruption from a raw water supply, we'd use the clear well storage.
Repeat that.
If there's a disruption from the raw water supply, we'd pump that up to the towers.
Correct. And that water is cycled regularly, so it goes out of the facility into the clear well storage, and then that goes to the distribution networks. And there are 8 or 9 pumps that pump water throughout Cary Apex. Cary also serves the town of Morrisville and RTP South, a portion of RTP in Wake County, and I believe 2 of those 8 pumps serve Apex specifically. Let's see. So I'm going to go into wastewater next. Any further questions on potable drinking water?
So, I mean, this whole discussion has been about potable water, but we're going to talk a lot about using reclaimed water. And when we're using reclaimed water, then this isn't relevant, right? Like, this is just if we're using potable water to supply the potential data center site.
That's correct. I think it's important to understand this aspect because reclaimed water is not something that Apex currently has. So I'll get into a little bit more detail about that in just a second. But I think from a perspective and an informational standpoint, I think it's important to also understand what the impact from a potable water standpoint would be, or through some of that downtime that Bruce mentioned a moment ago. All right. So on the wastewater side, we own or partially own two facilities. So the Apex Water Reclamation Facility, which is also known as what we kind of it's permitted as the Apex Water Reclamation Facility. We call it Middle Creek. That's the watershed that is in. That's over there off of 55 behind. I think it's the Colonial Pipeline, the big gas plant or transfer station there on 55 by Bojangles and all that, is 100% owned by Apex. So that's a pretty small facility. It was built a long time ago, original needs for Apex. So that facility has a capacity of 3.6 million gallons per day. And then I have on here the functional capacity is 2.8. So that's important because that facility drains into what we call a zero flow stream. That is the creation of that stream there, that tributary. And so we don't have what we call a water dilution factor. So wastewater has natural characteristics and typical, if it were to go into a river or an existing standing of water, you get that dilution factor. So you're allowed to sometimes discharge higher concentrations of certain things. So we're limited in what we can physically treat and discharge at that facility. So when I say functional, we would not allow a permit. We would not permit over 2.8 without making changes to that facility. And then our average daily flow there in 2025 was 1.1 million gallons per day, or 39.3% of that functional flow. And then I'll also note we're currently performing an optimization study and a reclaimed water study at that facility. So that optimization study targets exactly what I just mentioned about trying to determine what is necessary for us to achieve that full 3.6 permitted capacity. And then the reclaimed water study also looks at what infrastructure would be necessary to establish a reclaim system there. And so, and when I say a reclaim system, that's establish a distribution network. So there would be a pump station necessary to provide that. We don't have a storage device for reclaimed water. So we use reclaimed water in the facility. So there's reclaimed water used, but it doesn't necessarily have a distribution network.
Councilman Reese, did you have anything?
I might be, well, that's what I was keeping it to myself for right now, because am I borrowing numbers from the wrong columns? I see Apex average daily flow, 1.1 million gallons a day. First off, I don't know if there's any impact. I'd love to see median on the next time when we review these, just in case. I mean, it may not impact anything, but I'd just like to see both.
Sure.
I see the 1.1 million gallons per day, and some of these centers across the nation are requiring 500,000, million, or more a day. Am I borrowing numbers from the wrong columns and conflating them?
I didn't get that. Could you tell me?
Well, I'll say it again.
Siri doesn't know either. No, I don't think you're borrowing from the wrong column. I think again, that perspective is that's how significant some of these uses are, and that's a comparison of an existing facility that we have. So that's a very small proportion of the wastewater that we use in Apex. The next slide is going to have much larger numbers at Western Wake. So Western Wake is the wastewater facility that we co-own with Cary out in New Hill. That's where probably 80%, don't quote me on that number, about 80% of our flow, at least 2/3 goes to Western Wake. That's in the Cape Fear River Basin. That total facility capacity there is 18 million gallons per day. We own 34% of that. There will be a quiz on all of our percentage ownerships at the end of this. So that brings our capacity to 6.12. So our average daily flow in 2025 there was 5.05 MGD. I'm questioning that number because that's exactly the same as our water flow. So I'm going to clarify that number now in just a moment, but that's 82.5% of our capacity, which is accurate because we're going through expansion planning now. So with that facility, we work very closely with our partners in Cary. They just recently completed a master plan for the Western Wake facility that we were a part of, and that is to kind of master plan the life expectancy of the growth, I guess, of that facility, if that makes sense. So that master plan kind of lays out what that facility looks like on a long range perspective. So When Western Wake was originally designed and permitted in the late to mid 2000s, early 2010s, it was always planned to be a 30 million gallon per day facility. So that's currently what our master planning efforts are for an expansion of that, which is currently expected to commence in probably 2032 timeframe and will be about a 10-year process. So it'll be easily 2042 before we see additional flow at that facility.
Say that again.
About 10 years, or 2042, I'm sorry, before we see a completed expansion of that facility.
Complete expansion up to 30 million gallons per day.
Correct. That's the current plan right now.
But what does the glide path to that look like? Because I mean, just observe those two numbers are pretty close, right? Like 6.12 seems pretty close to 505, and adding 1 million to 505, that puts it at 605, right?
Yes. So the key there is we benefit somewhat from co-owning that facility with Cary. So Cary's flow is actually lower than our flow. We use over 50% of the flow at that facility. So that gives us the ability to allow Cary to supplement some of our needs on an interim basis. So we wouldn't expand the plant just for Apex's needs. If Cary has that capacity, there's a cost component. We have to compensate Cary for that allocation. But that is a very correct statement. So that's why we're looking at the expansion planning and going back to like our Apex plant where we are the only owner. When you reach 80% of your capacity, that's when you start your planning efforts for expansion. And then 90%, the state will not allow you to continue to permit without an approved or in progress project showing that you're planning to expand that facility.
So is it accurate to say there is capacity at the plant, we just don't own it? And
Correct. That is
buy
a
it or
correct
rent
statement.
it from Cary, if needed.
And part of the expansion planning efforts that we're going through with Cary staff is looking at our ownership percentage. So that may change in the future as well. We may increase the percentage of ownership. So right now we own 34%, and based on our long range planning efforts, that shows that we'll need additional ownership in that facility moving forward.
Okay. And how do we pay for that?
I mean, we would program that through our CIP process, but there would likely be bonds or revenue financing and things of that nature to cover. That's a pretty substantial cost.
It is. Is there a mechanism to pass? So if we have one user coming in instantly requiring us to purchase 20% more of the capacity in order to service it, could we not just pass the cost along to them and say, hey, we got to buy, this upgrade? Is that feasible? Is there some sort of capacity fee or something equivalent of it?
So there are a couple different ways that you can explore that. So as a user were to come in, and I'm going to kind of piggyback on the water question because I didn't actually answer the water pressure question a minute ago, but any type of significant or any user that comes to our system, both significant or what we would consider insignificant, like a small residential development, they have to provide us a water model showing what their impact is for both water, and we do a downstream sewer analysis. So all of that goes into our long range models that we currently have and that get updated regularly. And that's where we look at impacts. And so if we were to have a significant user come in that was proposing to provide 1.5 million gallons of additional wastewater to our facility, there would be a component there where we would look at, hey, this triggers X, Y, and Z, and there would be a cost share component likely as a part of that through some type of legal agreement. I don't necessarily have a means to just require that, but we can't permit additional flow than what we have allocated, so or ownership of. So that would be a part of a process when we actually have an application and we have that demand in hand.
Is this the kind of thing that would be figured out by rezoning time, or is it something that's site plan future issue we'll work on?
So I think it's very critical that for me to explain that we don't guarantee water or wastewater to a user unless there's an alternative means through a separate agreement or process that we've taken place. But standard practice is you're not guaranteed flow until I sign your water or sewer extension permit. And I'm the designee for that for the town. So that flow is what we call paper flow. So it's on books. We're looking at it from a very high level analytical perspective, but there's no necessarily guarantee, even if you submit a site plan and it gets approved, that I will sign that. I have all this power, but the town were to give or grant that flow. So through that process, that's where we would have the analysis done. We would work with Carrie, especially in the case that if we were to need to supplement that flow in the interim period, on what that capacity fee would be for that.
Do you have an idea of what's on paper versus actual right now?
Right, I can get that number. I don't have it off the top of my head, but we track
I'm
that.
curious for both water and wastewater.
Sure. So we don't track water on books, but we do track sewer.
Are we anticipating that Cary would have the willingness to sell their share? I mean, we're kind of operating under the assumption that we can purchase whatever we want. That would also limit Cary from expansion and use of their own resources as well. So
Sure. So I don't want to speak.
Cary, I might would say, why would I want to sell that?
Sure, I don't want to speak for Carrie, so I definitely want to reiterate that I'm not speaking on their behalf, but we have had discussions about those interim periods. So when I'm speaking about a capacity purchase, we have had those discussions with Carrie's staff from an interim basis on what that increase of ownership looks like. So that we're in the very infancy stages of that, but those conversations are being had. We meet with Carrie regularly. So
I think it's important if in a practical sense, if we go down this route and there's some interim purchase, that the public knows exactly what those costs are and how we're going to pay for it.
Absolutely. So, as we go through this process, I think it's very important to understand if we were to get an application in with actual demand numbers, right? The staff would take that information and we would work through what that looks like and impacts to our existing system, and through either our existing fee structure or through recommendation of an agreement come before the board for an approval to cover some of those costs for impact to our network.
The hospital that's been approved, I'm assuming is that considered paper?
So it's not considered paper flow until I go back to that permit being signed. So we have, or I would say unofficial paper flow. So we track it. So we have a very robust spreadsheet that tracks each pump station, each large user, that kind of thing, so that we know what those impacts are. Because the same question about impact to our wastewater facility, if that facility were to go through a pump station, it would likely trigger improvements to be necessary for that pump station. And so that process goes through, they as the applicant completes those improvements, or they would provide a financial means. From an expansion of a wastewater facility, we would likely not ask the applicant, or that would not be an opportunity. They would not have that opportunity to physically do it. We do that on pump stations all the time, where they go in and they expand, or they build a new pump station and we abandon the existing pump station.
I was going to ask about the average daily flow, and you said I appreciate that you'd offer the median numbers next time we see these slides. Can you talk about the distribution throughout the year, the 12 months, and how that looks when, sometimes we experience drought conditions, and what you mentioned earlier about the 14 days offline?
Sure. So, and I keep talking about reclaimed. I haven't actually gone into my reclaim slide, but for distribution networks, that's where that storage comes into play. So the mayor asked about pressure earlier, and so having appropriate elevated storage, that elevation, so all of our tanks have the same bowl elevation, so they're all designed at the same height. They may look different, but it's based on the topographic area of the region. So that's what determines the pressure. So the only time that we risk having reduced pressure is if those tanks were to lower or empty. And then from a distribution network standpoint, that's where the water modeling comes into play. So pipes are sized appropriately. We have a long range, what we call a water distribution master plan. So that's very similar. I know y'all talk about transportation a lot, so it's very similar to a transportation plan. So that's what we anticipate the size of the pipe needing to be based on a horizon year. And our current water master plan is a 2045 plan that we are in the process of updating now. So that's where we look at minimum size pipe for water. Say this development triggers a 6-inch pipe, but our master plan shows it needs to be a 12. Then the town has an oversizing agreement where we would oversize that pipe and provide compensation for that difference so that we're not having to go and replace that pipe in the future. So I say that to say as that process goes in, when we have a user and applicant come in for water, they provide us their demands. They are required to provide that physical model. We have a consultant that then it puts that in our model, the town's model, and we make sure that that jives and that matches. And if there's any improvements or anything that's triggered based on that information, that would be a requirement of the developer or the applicant to do.
All right, go ahead to your next slide.
Sure. So I say all that to say, I think it's also very important to, I'll go back to those, but I think it's important to also understand that we can require whatever we want up front. That's the easy part. But we also have to look at what that long-term impact to the system is. So we talked a lot about power earlier and what those long-term impacts are for ratepayers and things like that. So we go through the same exact exercises on the water and wastewater side. So if we were to expand our facility just to serve one user and that user were to walk away, then the town is now having to continue to operate and maintain a facility that's larger than those needs. So that's a consideration as a part of this process. And then you have, so that those are like the long-term, what I call the long-term operation or O&M things. So the other thing is if you have infrastructure that's too large, then you have what are known as water quality and age impacts. So we monitor water quality. That's the contaminants or things that are within the water that we monitor to make sure that it's safe to drink. And then we have water age. So the longer the water sits, the more deteriorated it gets. And then you get more taste and odor issues. You have a higher risk of lower water quality. So that's a lot of times why you see, you may drive through and you see a little black box that says water flushing taking place. That's likely being done to protect or increase the integrity of that water because it's at a dead-end line or something of that nature. So having too robust of a system with not a lot of demand causes operational impacts, and that's what we call water loss. We're just dumping water on the ground to make sure that it's safe for our user. And so that's also impacted based on the variability of usage. So if we design our system or the improvements based on the peak month of July, that has an impact in January if the use is significantly lower. So that's all a part of that equation. So the other part of that is the on-site storage. So we talked about having on-site storage a moment ago. The more on-site storage that can be provided also reduces the burden on the town because our distribution and connection point is more consistent. That allows them to utilize that on-site storage during peak times, and then we don't have that detrimental or that impact to the rest of the system. All right, as I promised, I'll talk about reclaimed water. So reclaimed water is treated wastewater. So it is not raw wastewater. So it has been treated, comes out clear. You shouldn't drink it when it comes out of the wastewater facility, but that is the water before it is put into a body of water. So I'll go back to Western Wake for an example. That water is pumped and piped to the Cape Fear River. So all of that water in that effluent pipe is considered reclaimed because it has not touched a body of water, and you have the dilution factor and things like that. And then it gets, it goes through that cycle and then it's retreated. Western Wake is downstream of Jordan Lake, so every bit of water that leaves the Western Wake facility or the Apex water reclamation facility, we don't necessarily see that water again. Our downstream users do. So Middle Creek is a Neuse River Basin tributary, so it goes into ultimately the Neuse River Basin, and Western Wake goes into the Cape Fear River, so it goes down towards Fayetteville and Wilmington areas for their use. And then, for example, we get a lot of our water from our northwestern municipalities. They provide wastewater towards the Hall River, and then you get that into Jordan Lake. So I say that to say, let's see. So reclaimed water is operated like a domestic system. It's a distribution network. A lot of times you'll see purple pipes. I was just in Florida. They have a very robust reclaim system in Florida, so you'll see that light purple. Or if you ever go to a facility and you're in the bathroom using the bathroom and you see "Don't drink this water," that is not for human error. That is because it's likely a reclaimed water source. I don't recommend anybody drink water out of their toilet, but you'll see that on a facility to let you know that they're using reclaimed water for that purpose. So while the intent of reclaimed water is all positive, that also has an impact on our downstream users. So we have what are called interbasin transfer certificates, and then there's also expectations of our downstream utility partners that we're going to provide X amount of wastewater for their use, because we're in essence taking from Jordan Lake, right? We take it there and then we discharge it in another location. So it's always intended that it's a life cycle process. So when you talk about water loss and things like that, that has an impact on what we see downstream, and you'll see PwC in Fayetteville or Cape Fear Public Utilities will contact us or be upset, those kinds of things, because we want to make sure that we're not robbing from their water source through their planning efforts.
What's our capacity on that one, right? So because that I didn't find in the analysis, right? So how much water can we take out of the system, right? We talked a little bit earlier about, 1.5 million gallons, let's say 30% evaporate, so we lose 500,000 gallons.
Sure.
Is that acceptable? Is that not acceptable? What are our thresholds?
So there's not a firm threshold on that. It's more of a, we have always led our downstream partners to believe, hey, this is our facility, this is what we anticipate that flow to be, and there are numbers that we're comfortable taking from a reclaim system perspective. So all of the discussions that we have had with Kerry regarding reclaim at Western Wake have been limited to 1 million gallons per day. That's the comfort level that we have before we think we'll have issues downstream from an impact standpoint. So any demand of a facility using reclaim at Western Wake would be required to have on-site storage to maintain that additional delta. In this case, we've been using 1.5 as an example. They would be required to have at least 500,000 gallons per day of on-site storage to cover that difference.
So where are they going to get that water then?
So we would provide it, but it would have to be stored on site. So it's kind of a cycle, I guess, because we wouldn't be providing it 1.5 consistently.
They're banking it.
Yeah, they're exactly.
And then spending in drought situations or
correct, or during a peak,
yeah,
a peak or something like that. Yes,
okay.
And so I also want to reiterate that neither our Apex facility or Western Wake have existing reclaim distribution networks. So any user of reclaim or requirement of reclaim would be required to construct whatever is necessary to provide that service.
And so how much of that million gallons that we're comfortable with is being used today for whatever set of purposes, be that irrigation or something?
So I don't have a number of what Western, because there's a water or an internal reclaim that they use for what's called process water that allows the system to function. I believe the restrooms at Western Wake are also a reclaim system. So I don't necessarily have that number today. I can get that information for you. But right now there's not a significant, what I would call a significant user of reclaim. It's all internal to the site that we would just call loss of process water.
And I think this is important because it defines our constraints, right? When we're considering projects, be it a data center or even another industrial use that has high water usage, we're limited on potable water, right? And there's limits on non-potable water, right? And I think it's important for us to understand what those constraints are, right? So that, right off the bat, we might be able to, or might not even be able to consider certain projects, right? Because of the constraints that we need to operate within.
Correct. And so one of the things that we have is what we call a long-range water resources plan. And so that was completed most recently in the end of 2023. So any high user of data center or even the hospital site were not considered as a part of that process. So again, I'm going to go back to planning because y'all deal with that on a more regular basis. So that's like the comprehensive plan of water resources so that we can plan long-range efforts for water and sewer. And that tells us when we think Western Wake will need to be expanded, when we think Cary Apex Water Treatment Plant will need to be expanded. And so those look at highest and best use of what's provided in the comprehensive plan. And then we have figures that are provided by regulatory agencies, similar to what Bruce provided on like a per capita or per use type facility. And that's how we determine what we estimate based on our growth and that rollout or that development of what we think we will use in 2025 or 2030, 2035. And so that's how expansion plans are taken into account. So when we talk about these significant users, they do have an impact and they take a lot of time and effort because we have to take a step back. We don't necessarily have a guiding document that provides that information specifically, in this case, for an unknown demand at this time. So going back to your question about the hospital, there was already programmed use in that area, so that impact is not as great because we had a planned mixed or whatever the original master plan showed for that would be a delta, so it would only be a smaller increase versus just hitting us with a significant impact to the system, such as an unknown use, such as the data center.
Question. So if somebody comes in at 1.5, is that a guarantee for the town to have to be able to supply a flow of 1.5 on a daily? I mean, what if something happens where we have drought situation? Is there going to be an end user that takes precedent over residents?
So I think that's another part of the consideration process. So we have an existing water conservation ordinance that I probably need to reread. We don't go through drought very frequently, so I don't have that ordinance memorized, but there are different stages of drought and what restrictions are. But it's very difficult to take water once you give it. So making sure you're planning for what that looks like on the front end is integral to the process because if we were to just say, hey, you can't flow water, that would cause a lot of, trickle down effects.
That's why it's important to go down the reclaim route because it's not affecting our potable water supply.
Correct.
And so, yeah, that seems like a no-brainer. But I mean, the implication there is if we're talking about reclaim, that really limits the sites we would consider in the next several decades for any of these things.
Because of proximity to the treatment plant.
Like no one's going to build a 5-mile-long reclaimed water system. Well, maybe they will. I don't know. The other question I wanted to, Chris Bonning, you touched on a little bit is in terms of the discharge requirements. I think I heard you use the word expectation earlier, but not a requirement. Do we have a firm discharge requirement into Cape Fear?
Discharge in terms of like what's in the wastewater or a number?
Wastewater discharge, total discharge.
I don't know that we have a specific, like we are required, because that's all based on demand, right?
Well, what's the point of the IBTs then?
So
there's no requirement anyway.
Well, IBT is taking from one basin and putting it in another. So there are hard limits there. So like the Apex plant, for example, there are multiple pump stations that pump to Apex, and that's a basin transfer. So it comes, or anything in the Neuse River Basin that's treated at Apex is a basin transfer because all of our drinking water comes from the Cape Fear. So from Cape Fear to Cape Fear is not as big of an issue from a tracking standpoint as it is to the Neuse.
Let me elaborate. I think Middle Creek to Cape Fear, interbasin transfer, there's agreement, there's a document, we can only use a certain amount of it, we're required, it's a regulatory thing.
That's correct.
And the problem is because we're not discharging as much in Middle Creek, that's important to people who use that water, et cetera, right?
Yes, it is.
But what's the difference between that and just evaporating off 30%? We still don't discharge as much, but that doesn't require some agreement. There's no regulatory problem with us evaporating it. As long as we're not putting it in another basin, that's an IBT. But if you take 30% of the water and you evaporate it,
from a regulatory standpoint, no, there's not, because we're returning the water to the same basin. The issue would be there could be a legality issue where a downstream user could come to Apex and say, hey, you have been planning for all these years to do X, Y, and Z, and now you're changing that, and that impacts our ability to have drinking water or water supply in the future. So
So if you take 10 million gallons and then you use it and then you apply some use and now it's 7 million gallons and you return that to the same basin, there's no problem with that. Even though if you take 10 million gallons and you put 3 million in a different basin and then return 7 million to your first basin, that's an IBT and that's needs a permit from DEQ and everything.
Yeah, it requires what's called an interbasin. So IBT is interbasin transfer, for those that don't know what that stands for. So that's when you're transferring from one basin to another, and then that we're issued what's called a certificate for that, and that's an approval from the environmental commission that allows us to do that. So, not to put our neighbors on blast, but you've probably seen a lot of stuff in the news about Fuquay Arena and an IBT. So that's the process that you go through to take water from one basin to another. And so that process is to limit. The reason that exists is it is a challenge, yes, but it's to prevent you from taking all of your water from one river or watershed and putting it in another, because that now creates.
Do you see my point though? Like I'm expressing surprise that the problem with interbasin transfer isn't the putting the water in the second place, it's taking it from the first place. Like they're losing water.
Right.
And evaporation, where you take water from the first place, whether it goes to second place or it goes in the air and rains in the ocean in 2 weeks, it's still a loss from the first place. So I guess I'm surprised there's no explicit discharge requirements or related to kind of in the IBT framework. You see what I mean?
Sure. I think it's not related to the IBT because it's not technically an IBT, right? It's in the.
It isn't.
Yeah.
But it is a loss of water from a basin, which is what IBTs try to address.
And so I think that's where it comes down to. It would be contingent on the downstream utility to come to Apex and say, hey, for all these years, you've been planning to discharge 18 million gallons, and now you're telling me you're only going to do 16.
Legality, so you're saying they might sue us and say, hey, you're not discharging enough water.
Because they have to now figure out how they're going to make up that additional 2.
But is that encoded in agreements, or is that a firm handshake and a nod, right? So like, what are the parameters that we need to operate within, right? So we have declared we are okay with 1 million gallons of reclaimed water not going back into the Cape Fear. But I think what Mayor Pro Tem is getting at, and kind of related to my earlier question too, is like, what governs that, right? If it's not like regulatory requirements like an IBT, is there agreements, formal agreements that we have with our downstream utilities, or is it really, best effort on our part, right? And
sure. So
there's really no constraints. I'm trying to understand where the limits are, right, and what governs those limits.
A lot of it's governed by when Western Wake was permitted originally. We have a permit for 30 million gallons per day. We don't have authorization to construct a 30 million gallon per day facility, but there's a permit. So that is what governs our ability to take the 30 and return the 30.
Right.
They're separate processes, but it's all a part. It kind of all comes
But now
together.
we decided to take 30 and put in 20.
And so that 30 is where the Fayettevilles, the Cape Fear Public Utility Authorities, they use that in their planning documents, their long-range planning efforts,
Right.
and they use the figures that we give to say, hey, we think in 2030 we'll be providing you 14 in the Cape Fear. So that's where it comes down to. It would take, if we were to have a significant impact on that and their operation, it would likely be just between the utilities or multiple utilities. There's not necessarily a regulatory mechanism that requires me or the town to discharge X million
The
gallons.
permit doesn't say we have to discharge 30 million gallons. It says we're allowed to process 30 million gallons.
I will clarify that, but I do not believe it does.
I mean,
I don't know the number, but I'm pretty sure that he's 100% correct as far as IBT. But there is a guaranteed return in the Apex, with the Carry Apex agreement with the downstream users, because there was a large lawsuit many years ago. I don't know that number. So I think that goes back to where John was saying they're comfortable with 1 million, but it's kind of like any other thing, right? If you just look at the simplicity of it, if you take everybody who was upstream and they all took water out to drink it, and then they evaporated it all and they never returned any to the river, everybody downstream wouldn't have anything to drink, right? So if you went to it on an extreme level, so there is an expected return in general, but I think in this case, I think they did work out an agreement. I do not know the number.
All right, if you can find the agreement, can you mail it out to us?
Yes, sir.
Thanks.
All right. So we talk about amounts of wastewater being returned. So the condition or what's in that wastewater is also equally important. So in Apex, we have what is called a pre-treatment ordinance. So pre-treatment means that if your wastewater is has other constituents beyond what's in domestic wastewater, you have to meet our pretreatment ordinance. And so that's the condition of the water when we, as the town, accept it. The other caveat there is for the co-owned facility at Western Wake, both our ordinance and the town of Cary's ordinance has to be followed. They're basically the same, but whichever one would be more conservative in that particular case would govern in that instance. So in Apex, we have very few what we call industrial use permits. So we issue a permit anytime you have constituents in your wastewater that are greater than the limits in the ordinance. I won't bore you with all those details. But that's a process that is reviewed by staff. There's a sampling component of that to verify that the wastewater is indeed meeting what those requirements are. And that's a cost that's bared by the user. And then we do random sampling throughout the year as well to vet that information that's done by the independent lab. So this is some of the constituents of concern for wastewater related to data centers. So Heather Cheslick of Black and Beach did a presentation at the One Water conference this year. This is an excerpt from her presentation. So kind of talks through some of the constituents of concern related to that. And we don't know what those are until we know the types of cooling of the facility and what the condition of that is, whether it's closed loop or open loop, that evaporation component. And it also has to do with the cycles of concentration. So the more that water is concentrated or cycled through the closed system, the constituents increase because it's continuing to utilize that water. So there's a lot of components that have potential negative effects on the wastewater process. But then at the same time, you also don't want clean water, like really good quality water, to go back in the wastewater system, because that also causes a negative effect on the process as well. So I also want to reiterate that a lot of what we've talked about here related to data centers is outside of the expertise of a lot of our staff. So one of the things that we've been working through is I've made good friends with Ms. Cheslick, and we've been talking through a team of experts to help the town make recommendations and decisions on what our ordinances and our processes should look like related to capacities, data centers. And then Bruce has done a lot of research and talking with communities that have gone through the same things as us, and I have received late last week contacts of utility providers so that we can also use their lessons learned to help guide the recommendations that we provide to y'all. All right, so that is all of my talking points. Now, I'm sure there will be more questions.
I got through my questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I don't know if I gave you too much detail or.
Very much.
We've talked to air pollution. Bruce, I'm looking at you, and maybe Randy, I don't know, in terms of the air pollution topics coming up, but I didn't know if I should save that. Oh, yeah, I mean, it's under environmental impact. But
Yeah, we
ask-
skipped ahead so that I could answer the water questions,
Awesome.
but I think we're going to go back.
I was just going to ask if you were able to speak from your subject matter expertise in regard to the aerosoling of the wastewater and what those impacts might be from your perspective.
Like air quality from the constituents of the wastewater?
Again, I know we're about to talk, but I was
Sure.
talking about from your perspective.
So I am not an air quality expert, so I want to reiterate with that. But from a wastewater air quality standpoint, I don't know that there's a lot of concern from the staff level on that because of our pretreatment requirements. So before we would receive any of that wastewater, it would have to meet those certain standards, those parameters of that ordinance.
And
So
the PFAS, can we talk briefly about why? I don't think I see it listed as a chemical hazard, and I was just curious what the definition was and if you had professional feedback on those impacts.
So I haven't done a lot of research specifically on PFAS related to wastewater at data centers. PFAS is generally right now targeted more on the drinking water side. So there's a lot of components in the Cary Apex raw water supply component that target the PFAS. But from a constituent standpoint, from the information that I have received from the experts that we've discussed it with, PFAS is not a top concern for data centers.
Based off of what?
The information.
Like you're finding that it's not based off of like, how do you evaluate? Oh, that's low, that's high. Like, what are you evaluating?
So there are parameters that the EPA provides, but that's an emerging contaminant. So a lot of the regulatory requirements for it are still evolving on a daily basis. It's, I think, been very much a catch-up exercise as it has become such a hot topic and a major area of concern here recently, but I don't have a lot of information related to it on the wastewater side.
Thank you.
So are you talking specifically about like the cooling tower leachate or anything specific with the PFAS question, or?
Do I need to be specific? I guess what I'm trying to do is ask layperson questions to subject matter experts on behalf of the 84,000 and change folks who live in this town.
So what I am not a subject matter expert on PFAS, so I want to specify that. What I can do is that can be one of the topics that we research further with the experts to get more information on that.
I think the concern is the concentration in the return wastewater from the evaporation would necessarily concentrate whatever's in there, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
And how does the treatment of that water then affect our equipment when it gets returned, the pretreatment?
So PFAS is not currently a part of the pretreatment ordinance.
Why is that?
Again, I think the focus and the research and everything so far has been on the drinking water side. That's where our regulatory requirements are. There's been a lot of discussion at both the state and federal level on PFAS and wastewater, but that's not necessarily reached our regulations yet.
Hasn't reached your regulations.
Like Apex is not bound by a permit to have this concentration of PFAS in our discharge.
Okay. Thank you.
I've got just one final question for me, at least. So the Western Lake Regional Water, you said that right now we're doing a little over 5 million gallons a day, a daily flow right now. Those are actual numbers, correct?
Yes, so we get data from Cary monthly from that facility, and then we have flow monitors at the Apex facility, and I get those numbers about once a week from the operators.
So in your master plan, though, you've taken into consideration Viridia.
Correct.
That whole project, which is all of that's going to the Western Lake Regional Water, right?
It's planned to, yes.
To the Big Branch. How does planning or at what point do we sit there and say, okay, we're going to have to limit development at this point simply because our already approved development is going to max that out? Looking at a hospital and looking at 3,000 houses, that probably gets to your 1 million gallons a day that'll happen in the next 3 to 5 years, period, and guaranteed.
Sure. So that goes back to the discussion I was having earlier about excess capacity at the facility as a whole. And so the conversations that we've had with Cary's staff and regarding that are exactly that. It's allowing us to use excess capacity that Cary has in the facility while we determine what the reappropriation of ownership of that facility looks like. Because what Cary doesn't want to do, or Apex is of the cost impact, is expand a facility that doesn't necessarily need to be expanded. So
Right.
it's really a reappropriation of the ownership versus actual expansion of the plant
Okay.
in the immediate needs. But our long range plan did, one of the areas in the long range plan was a special study area, and that was Viridia specifically. So we do have estimated timelines of when we think that flow will make its way to Western Wake.
Are you concerned about any other unforeseen stresses on the capacity at this plant specifically? And I'm thinking of like a regulatory requirement that we start serving Holly Springs because they have a bunch of very important economic development projects that can't meet their wastewater thing. So there's not going to be a law saying you Apex, you have to treat it here.
I don't want to speak for the legislators. I don't foresee the state requiring Apex to treat, or Apex and Cary to treat another locality's wastewater. They're certainly incentivize, like, not incentivizing, but there's documentation that supports, like, hey, this is what we as the state think you should do. We talked about that at a council meeting several months ago, but not necessarily concerns. Now, if we do get a significant user, every significant user, there's a concern, because that's now 1.5 million gallons that we are 1.5 million gallons per day that we can't utilize somewhere else. And so that has a backwards effect on all that long range plan, because that's, one, not perfect, right? That's what we think will happen based on our approved documents. But every time a project comes in or it goes through a process, that modifies that. So the first rezoning that takes place after the long range water resources plan is approved, that differs from the original plan. That plan's technically out of date at that point, because that's now changed the forecast. So we're in the process. One of my goals next year is to update that plan from 2023, because a lot of things have come in that have changed, such as the hospital and things like that. But that goes into every significant user. We evaluate that site and how that looks at the whole system. So I can't sit up here and tell you that we can take all these, 4 or 5 of these come in, that kind of thing. But it does have a long-term effect on both the water supply and the wastewater, but everything does. So I can't sit here and say that this one thing has a different impact. It's the sheer volume of the impact that's different, and that's why we gave you, or we thought it would be valuable to give you those figures to show, like, hey, for example, 1.5 million gallons per day equivalates to this many homes, this many apartments, this type of school, that kind of thing.
So I'm not going to put words in your mouth. I'm going to ask you if I'm understanding it correctly, that there is capacity over a short to medium range period of time, 1 to 5 years, perhaps longer. I don't know. I'm asking what your opinion is in terms of.
So
there's capacity for one of these projects, and we better get it right if we're getting it right, because at that point you've maxed out, unless it's a project that's using some other type of cooling technology.
So there's capacity, but there's not necessarily, and we don't have unlimited capacity. So if we were to allocate 1.5 million gallons per day of wastewater, theoretically, to a data center, that is now whatever all those figures in that other table equate to, that we cannot, that replaces that. So it's more of a give or take versus, yeah, we can do this and that. It's because it's a finite. I mean, there's a finite amount of water. There's a finite. Well, I don't want to say there's a finite amount of wastewater. We can probably expand the plant to be as large as we want, but there's a cost component to that. And so it comes down to, is it worthwhile to continue to expand that plant or slow the growth rate?
That additional, does that impact maintenance on facilities?
Sure. So the larger the facility, the more staffing, the more components. That's also now, it'll be 11 years old this year. So it's It's no longer a brand new facility, so there's components there. So we work closely with Cary when they have both their operating costs, but also their long-term CIP needs that we funnel. That kind of funnels through our budget process separately from our other projects. But the larger the facility, yes, there's an impact for sure. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And thank you for taking our questions.
Absolutely.
All right, we're going to jump back to a couple of slides where we were. We were talking about environmental impacts. Okay, I think we had just spoken about generators and getting more information. Mr. Matthew had spoken about wanting more, perhaps emission data and things to look at for that. So understood.
Can I ask a supplemental question for research? The difference between diesel generators and gas-powered generators,
absolutely.
and the difference in emissions.
Yeah, and another is the type of diesel used. And there's much cleaner biodiesel. I don't know if the technology ever made it to market, but there was a FT diesel, otherwise known as Fischer-Tropsch diesel. It's an advanced biofuel. And I'm trying to think of what other, and then there might be renewable diesel, but I worked in that industry in a different life 15 years ago, and I don't know if any of those ever made it to market. But I know biodiesel did, and I know that it's regularly available. So I was just curious what that would look like for air quality.
Sure, absolutely. Happy to do it.
Yeah, I just think the theme is, we're concerned about the air quality impact of all these diesel generators, and that's something that could be mitigated by different alternative technologies. Is that on the table? Something we could maybe even require. And likewise, a lot has been spoken about the Type 4 diesel generators or something. I don't really know what that means. They're gooder.
Gooder, yes, sir.
Can we get a Type 5 diesel generator? Can we get a Type 7?
There's supposedly a Tier 4 final that I found somewhere along the way. Yeah, it's a whole nother designation. I don't know if those ever made it to market, though.
Yeah, and that comes down to the point of where is the technology? Will there be some point in the near future where the concerns about the diesel generators have been mitigated by the technology? What does that really look like is something I'm looking to learn, because I hear the concerns. It does sound concerning.
Yeah, those are great points. Another thing we'll talk about a little bit later on is, whether we can get rid of generators altogether by having other means like battery backups and things like that. So we'll talk about that, but I can happily research those. All right. Another environmental impact, we talked on water quality and quantity. Jonathan did a great job explaining that. Like we talked about, large volumes of water could impact potable water reservoirs that are shared with other communities. It could degrade the environment and hurt the wildlife as well. Indirect, again, power generation facilities also require large amounts of water in order to operate and generate the power themselves. So we may think that we have enough water here and that it only has the direct impact, but it also could have potential indirect impacts elsewhere and affect other communities. You're not necessarily required to govern on those aspects, but it is something to be aware of as we research this topic.
And on this topic, it's asked in the document. I'm not sure if it shows up in the slides, but direct impact regarding well water, and should we allow the use of groundwater, and can we prevent it?
Yeah.
To me, that seems pretty obvious that we need to prevent the use of groundwater, because I know this region. I have neighbors who I've talked to, routinely deal with well failures. It's a big deal out there, and I think it's just a non-starter to even approach that from a practical standpoint.
Exactly. That's why it was one of your considerations or for evaluating whether or not you wish to prohibit that or not.
Yeah, I guess we do. Yeah. Agreed.
There is a table here. Jonathan touched on this a little bit. This is just the allocation of the Jordan Lake water supply. We have the allocation holders. We have Cary, Morrisville, Apex. And then on the side here, the allocation percentage, this is by percentage, also represents 1 million gallons of water per day. So just total distribution allocation right now is already at 91.2 out of 100%, so 1 million gallons per day. The remaining allocation is about 8.8 million gallons per day from that water supply.
And they just went through a reallocation, right? This
was the most updated one I received from our Water Resources Department.
Yeah. All right.
All right, ground contamination. So outside of perhaps doing groundwater and things like that, or types of energy storage, thermal energy storage, other ways the ground can be contaminated is just if there's some type of failure for the storing of coolants, diesel, or if there's some failure for backup battery backup batteries, energy storage, or contamination from biocides and other things for tower treatment. Equipment failure is kind of where we'd see this. We'll talk about ways that, again, you'll probably receive some information again at your next work session from Chief Herman, who will also speak about mitigation and how to contain those things as well.
I guess my main question on all this is like, what do we already have, right? Because some of this is not unique to data centers, right? And in particular, I'm thinking about the Sharon Harris plant itself with a huge evaporation tower, right? And so we're talking about like the chemicals that, are needed to keep those towers clean for a data center, but, we have something at scale already within our community, right? And so what do we already have in terms of regulations or preventative measures, that we are already familiar with and comfortable with, right? And how would data center use be different or equitable, to some of those standards that the UDO might already cover?
Sure. Speaking with Chief Herman, he's not here, so I hate to bring him up. But in the past, there's methods for mitigating some potential outfall if something were to have a failure or spill. Containment berms, impermeable layers, and things like that. He'll be able to speak a little bit more to that, what's required, because that's something they actively look at and they look at there. I can't speak to Sharon Harris at the moment. I'm happy to research any additional thing like that. But you're right that other industrial uses will have similar stuff on site.
Right. Or even farms, right? The farm stores or chemicals or biocides. So I'm thinking there must already be something that we know, right? And that's already in our community that we can, potentially draw a parallel to and say, yeah, here's how we're doing it. Here, we already have the rules and such in place. We'll just apply them to, this type of use.
Sure. Yeah. The reason this gets brought up is because there's a potential to have such large concentrations of things like, the diesel generators we'll talk about, but for a large scale, you could have about 90 diesel generators on site. Each one will have like a 6,000 gallon belly tank, and then there'll be additional tanks that feed into that to refill it from other places on the site as well. So 500,000 gallons, that's more than several gas stations put together. So it's just the concentration.
Which is also what prompted my natural gas question, or my natural gas powered question, right? Because that would also avoid having that on-site diesel storage plus the handling of the diesel, because that diesel needs to be refreshed after so many weeks or months, right? And so just kind of curious to see what gas powered versus diesel powered would look like, because I think there's some other benefits to it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard people also in other jurisdictions and even states moving towards natural gas as the primary source of power for the entire site as well in order to secure that. I'm not sure. I'll look into how much it's utilized for just the backup itself as well, so we can kind of compare and contrast what that might look like. But just also as we're talking about direct and indirect impacts, requiring natural gas or anything like that as well will have also impacts on the affordability of these potential products to people that rely on them for heating their homes and other things like that in the community. Just something to be aware of as well if we go down that route.
Just like power, it would have.
Exactly.
I got
it. Yeah.
But only if it's used, right? If it's only used for backup purposes, then the
less
use
of it will be used, absolutely,
be fairly minimal. So, anyway, asking you to look into that a little bit further for us.
Happy to do it.
Yeah, while we're talking about the ground contamination, I was going to say the refrigerants often contain PFAS as well. Yeah. And so I was just going to ask if staff could look more into the recommendations there around health impacts, perhaps CDC findings, things that we can be fully aware of the impacts.
Absolutely. I think I mentioned earlier, I have a new contact with a DEQ that I'm going to be utilizing quite frequently for this project, and I will see what they have, and I'll ask them what does it look like at the federal level as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, not a problem.
And can we get more feedback on PFAS being defined as a chemical hazard?
We can look into it.
Appreciate it.
Yep. As far as air contamination, you may have been alluding to this as well in your previous conversation. This came up in some of our town council public comment sections, and so we just wanted to address it, that their improper maintenance of building water systems can contribute to the growth and spread of potentially harmful bacteria such as Legionella that can lead to exposure. Exposure leads to like Legionella, which is type of fever, or Legionnaire's disease, which is a very severe pneumonia that can lead to death and organ failure and other types of things. It's rare, but given how the cooling works for these data centers, the water is evaporated, and if there's any kind of contaminant in there like this, and it's evaporated and spreads, and then blown far away, there's a potential that other people could be exposed to it, and so that's something to be aware of too. The report, I think there's a study from Spain that measured it, about 3 to 6 miles away, there was a concentration of Legionella outbreak there. So just as a reference, it's rare. The CDC does try and track. I'm not sure. I was just on it today, and I couldn't find anything for 2025 to speak to you about today.
Yeah, I see that section report, and I circled it, and I said, seems bad. Yeah. So, I mean, that's an argument for not allowing open loop systems at all. Like, if we do closed loop, then that's not an issue, right?
There's potentially still going to be some evaporation with closed loop. It does limit, it limits the amount of where the water travels to be able to build up this potential bacteria, because the water itself, the coolant, like if it's open loop, you're just having water travel through basically to cool the systems, and then it goes up and it goes out and then it goes out different ways. There's less water being utilized on the site potentially, and it's like in one concentrated area. But CDC and other organizations do have methods and procedures for dealing with it. But yeah, it's a scary idea. It's scary when you read about it without really having an opportunity to really dive into it. I agree.
But back to my earlier comment, we already have a massive evaporation tower in town with Sharon Harris, right? So
Require maintenance and regular.
Don't we have the same concern with that particular facility then?
And then a lot of this you can get contact from this bacteria from healthcare providers, hospitals, and things like that. Like fountains are, funny enough, can contain contaminants, and they're in the perfect environment where they have like sunlight and microbes to come in, and it could spread there too. The unique situation, like you've pointed to, is that these cooling stacks vaporize the air, and it allows it to travel in a different way, and that's how it's kind of consumed. But this bacteria can exist anywhere. It exists in nature already. It's just kind of a unique situation that we should be considering.
Are those other cooling towers evaporating wastewater?
They're not
Lake water, right? It's like Lake Harris.
Wastewater.
Right.
I'm talking with the PFAS.
Potentially.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
I
why would
would
there
like
be
to know more. Yeah, I'd like to know more about what that looks like.
I think they use treated wastewater for cooling.
No.
Yeah, they already treat the wasted water, but it still contains lots of harmful chemicals and bacteria, all those harmful things. Yeah.
Okay, we're at our policy considerations, potential mitigation measures section. For light pollution, we touched on. We do have a pretty good exterior lighting section in our ordinance already. If there's any additional things that need to be addressed, they can be potentially addressed through zoning conditions or potentially new amendments to kind of require those changes. We talked about the emissions, the tier 4 equivalent. I will let you know through conversations with people in the industry, and I think we've touched on it before, that the build out time for some of these equipment pieces are years out. And so what some of the developers have talked about, what they've had to do in the meantime, is take a tier 3 generator and retrofit it to have the same emissions output as a tier 4. And that's been kind of the practice that they've mentioned that's been happening, just because it's so hard to get their hands on a brand new tier 4 generator itself. So then additionally, consider the use of natural gas generators for backup emergencies, or even just natural gas as the primary power. That's something to consider. We talked about that. We'll look into more of that for you. And then reducing the spill contamination process, or getting more information on that for you as well, for berms, impermeable barriers, and preventing off-site contamination.
I'll say one thing about policy, requirements and that sort of thing, and this applies to noise as well. We've heard some feedback from the community that one of the concerns is, like, how do you have an effective penalty regime for a multi-billion-dollar corporation? How can you enforce those in a way that they don't just pay the fine of a couple $1,000 a day or whatever? So I'm not looking for an answer now, but certainly as we set up these standards, we have to make sure that they're done in such a way that they're enforceable by whatever means, and not just a minor penalty that they can pay and forget about.
Yeah, there's some new some other neighboring jurisdictions have adopted some things that we're looking into right now that might give us a bit more teeth in that kind of fight that we'll be able to present to you later on when we have more information. So yeah, happy to do that.
You gave some examples, I think, from Charlotte or other places where they were not complying and they had the meeting. And then if you're not complying, like there was a system where they would eventually get penalized.
There is for the noise in Charlotte, absolutely. I don't have it in front of me. I could jump to it. Edgecombe County, I believe, too, has something else that they've adopted in their recent ordinance that requires almost a new zoning compliance annually as well. And so we're talking with legal about what that would look like for us to do something like that based on something that could potentially become out of compliance. But we're not there yet to really have a recommendation or anything for you yet, but that's something we're looking into.
Yeah, if you could look into what best practices might be across the country. The point may have already been made, but I know specifically, for instance, like in, forgive anybody who's in major trucking, but it's a cost of doing business. You know, you just overload your trucks, you get pulled, you have an estimated number of times when your drivers are going to get pulled, and you pay the penalty. And so I think we just want to look around the country to see what do those look like to actually hold companies accountable.
Sure, absolutely. And this is a helpful process because, you know, we can look up kind of what other people are doing, but when hearing from you today what you consider to be important really gives us direction, and that's helpful. Just there's a note on here. We have received additional considerations regarding some of these, regarding environmental assessments and testing, monitoring, and things like that were shared with us from residents this month. We're still reviewing those, so some of this stuff may come to you at additional time for review because we may find that it is warranted and it would be good as part of this process. All right, noise. Data centers use large backup generators and have lots of air cooling systems, air handlers, and other types of things that generate lots of noise. Together, this equipment can produce high and low frequency noise that may impact nearby properties. Typically, this is measured by decibels, which measures sound intensity on a scale, where every 10 decibels increases what's represented as roughly twice as loud. It's hard to demonstrate that here, but maybe we can find somewhere just to show you what that's like in the future. Decibels are measured by the sound pressure. So there's different ways. Typically, you'll see things with a dBA next to the sound it creates. A dBA is a weighted scale. It's mostly designed, it's designed more so in the human range of hearing. Whereas DBC kind of falls outside of the frequencies that fall outside that we can't quite naturally perceive or understand that we're perceiving. Our body may still perceive some of the vibrations and the frequencies, but we're not actively perceiving it like we would with something in the dBA scan. So some communities are looking at this because there has been some outcry and frustration with data centers that are too close, generating this constant, continuous, low-frequency noise. And it's driving them crazy. And it's something that's a real problem and something we should be aware of as we talk about it. So like Jonathan said, we may be working with a professional acoustical engineer to kind of really figure out exactly what we should be looking at and come up with some ideal standards for this.
And again, drawing a parallel, we already have that problem in town with the CSX trains that are parked here out front overnight, where not only audible sound, but also the vibrations are a nuisance to the community.
Yeah, and this conversation, you know, may lead to not just specific noise regulations for data centers, but maybe even looking at the noise ordinance itself and how how we interact with that, and how we enforce that, stuff like that.
If you don't mind me pointing out that residents are not pleased with the engines sitting out and idling, and I remember it was a couple years ago that Representative Price, I think, actually came into this room because we were trying to address some federal railroad administration issues around that sound.
Well, there's a difference also, you know, when you choose to purchase a home right next to a railroad track, there's kind of this implied thing, kind of like RDU.
Yeah.
When you put a data center near a community that's already existing, they didn't have that choice.
That's right.
So we have to be very cognizant of that, like when we make that decision. They didn't choose to build a house next to a data center.
If you don't mind, I might repeat this in our next work session as well, but I was going to say eventually I'll put a story into the record where one of the perhaps they're new to their job, but I'll find the one. Oh, this is somebody with Caleb Max is CEO of the National Artificial Intelligence Association, a new DC-based trade group. He says, I think it's very important for the industry as a whole to be honest that living next to a data center is not an ideal situation. And then later in that same story published by Heat Map News, they talk about, to your point, about with a board of supervisor member, and the journalist asked if there was a form of responsible data center development, and he responded, I don't know if there is, at least where they're going to be economically feasible. So just want to state that. Thank you.
Absolutely. So just again, a visual representation of kind of what we're talking about. As you can see, like the top represents the 8-weighted scale. The area that's kind of blurred out by the green is kind of the frequencies or the part of the bands that aren't really being measured at this time. So you may set a standard for 65 dBA at the property line for any type of industrial use. And it might be that. It might be fine at the property line. But given the nature of low frequency waves that can potentially travel further away, you might have that even further on. And so that's something that when we've talked to some acoustical engineers about, you really have to get this right initially, because trying to mitigate it afterwards, you're always behind the 8 ball. It gets way more expensive. You're probably going to still end up failing in some way. So this is just an illustration of types of decibel levels here for you, how loud they are. Some levels you can have permanent damage, hearing damage, pain, and things like that. I just want to point out, so diesel generators, depending on the type, can fall between 90 and 110 decibels. That can cause possible hearing damage with either prolonged exposure, that can be considered very loud, and most likely at 110 cause damage at short exposure as well. So items that generate the noise as part of data centers, there's air-cooled chillers. These chillers are installed either at ground level or on the roof. They're notable sources of exterior noise due to the operation of large fans and compressors used to expel heat from the facility. These can add significant noise to the site. Cooling towers, we touched on that a little bit with water. Again, it's kind of the same aspect. They either use to disperse heat into the atmosphere and then recirculate it. It involves multiple mechanical opponents operating simultaneously, which generate noise. They could, depending on the size of the data center, there may be 1 to several dozen of these on any site. We talked at length about backup generators. Again, these can be very noisy. Ideally, they're only being operated for monthly maintenance testing and for emergencies only. I'm sure we've all heard horror stories about other jurisdictions or other states where maybe they're running their generators all the time and it's really causing issues there. More jurisdictions have been part of including higher quality emission generators. Generators that have better emission standards are also limiting the time of testing and when they can be operated. I wish Duke was here for this, because we do have a continuing question that I'm trying to get from them, is that Duke does have like their Power 50 program, which allows 50 hours of non-emergency usage during peak hours. And I'm still working on getting an answer how that would work for a data center if the grid's about to go down and they want them to fire up all their generators. We don't know for how long exactly what's that going to be like. So I'm still working on that, and that's something that we should consider as well, that those programs exist.
Again, drawing a parallel here, we have the peak load management program in place today, where we ask existing businesses in town to run their diesel generators at certain times to reduce the peak load, which is one of the main billing components to the town of Apex for our electric use, right? So there is some precedent here already for what, how that is being used, and it would be good to consider that, right, as we start comparing.
Who has that many backup generators on site in one concentration?
Not this many, but like,
yeah, I was going to say, I mean, this is
Walmart, Target, like we ask them to go to generator power.
But how many do they have?
Time. I don't know. I didn't go count.
I was going to say, I'd like to know.
Right.
To see, because I'd like to know. I mean, even if it's
it's not so much about the number of generators; it's about the policy and asking people to run their generators for a certain period of time.
And there's a need for it, like to maintain the grid. There is a need to do that at some time. So, but you as the governing body, you need to be aware that if you approve a development, that there's a potential that these generators may be running longer than you initially thought they would, because the best intentions were set that they would only run for maintenance and for emergencies. So just you could be aware, so you can communicate that to the public.
I was going to say, maybe we can revisit how to regulate that, or at least have some sort of, again, penalty. And it's my understanding that it's at minimum weekly.
I'll double check that. From what I've heard in conversations, it's monthly, but the concern is probably also the schedule, given that there's so many generators. That are they testing them, a pot of them at a time weekly, and to get through the entire month. So that definitely requires further follow-up.
And this is anecdotal. That said, I would like to look into what communities are satisfied with data centers that are near them regarding noise pollution. The reason I say that, I have a neighbor who works in AI infrastructure, came to me with thoughts. And he said he was recently on a business trip to Dallas, Texas, where his hotel was near a data center, and he said he couldn't sleep for a week, the whole week he was there. And I said, how far away were you? He said, I don't know, that thing must have been 1.5 miles, 2 miles away. So I was just curious if we could look into what perhaps is appropriate for whether it's distance, the devil in the details on the decibels. I've read about A decibels versus C decibels, all sorts of stuff I don't know anything about. It's over my head, but I know there are people who do know the answers, and it'd be great to have them.
Absolutely. And as we continue to engage with potential consultants, we'll bring you updated information from experts.
And to piggyback on that, also, just make sure the schedule, right? Because my experience, and I actually built a data center, N+1 compliant data center for GSA. They were on a schedule, and it was multiple generators, but they would constantly going off. But that's how they had to test them. They're not going to test them all at once. It was on a rolling schedule. So yes, you might fire up one in a month, but you've got a lot of them. So they roll the schedule, and so they're constantly running. So one of them at least is doing something at some point in time.
Exactly.
Thank you for telling this. Yeah.
To your point, maybe perhaps a reasonable number of them running at a certain time.
Right.
And hours, I don't know.
Another noise generating piece of equipment is the air handling units. They provide adequate ventilation to remove heat and airborne contaminants, and they maintain acceptable operating temperatures within the server halls. They're typically located on the rooftop. The quality of air handling units may be significantly higher. Quantity may be significantly higher than that of typical office or industrial uses when operating simultaneously. Air handling units can generate combined noise levels above the typically accepted decibel level near residential uses. So again, you have a perfect storm sometimes with data centers, where I'll show you some visual examples where you just kind of have perfect storm of like multiple these things are running continuously for 24-hour periods outside of the generators, ideally, hopefully not running for those periods. Another visual example, we can see ACs, we can see some tanks, we can see the cooling towers in the bottom right corner. Here's an example of layout and location of generators and cooling equipment and their proximity to residential uses. Again, there we can see we have all these units on top of the top there. We have the generators to the right, and then we also have multifamily residential not far away. Another example, more data centers next to single family homes this time. And so here we are at the considerations and potential mitigation measures for this section. Enforceable, so again, you guys are all hitting the head on the head talking about measurable and enforceable use standards via either zoning conditions that address the high and low frequency noise, prioritizing the utilization. We would like to see, and other jurisdictions are also doing this, a pre and post construction noise study to model what the noise ambient level is out there right now, what it will be at the time of build out, and then also maybe going back after the time of build out, post construction, to see if it actually meets those standards, and if not, mitigation measures may be required or should be required.
What about continuous monitoring? Otherwise,
yep, absolutely. I think as communities get more sensitive to that, you're going to probably see more of that as well.
Yeah, I'd also ask, one of the things mentioned, maintenance times for the generators. Would it make sense to vary that by season based on the ambient air quality? Like if we're concerned, the concern is the diesel generators are going to impact the air quality. That might be a bigger issue in the summer when things are hazy and terrible. Could restrict it more then.
Absolutely.
And again, same enforcement question of how exactly what do we do? you know, to make sure it happens? Can we put a stop work order? Shut it down if you don't, if you're too loud.
But you gotta still keep in mind, like, those generators are there for when the power's out.
Yeah.
They're gonna stay on.
Yeah,
So they're all gonna kick on,
yeah,
and they're all gonna make noise.
right.
They're only sitting there idle and being maintained until that catastrophic event happens where they don't have power. And now we have to go to UPS for a split second while we're firing up generators, and now we're generating our own power. So there will come a time where they will all be on, and it's designed to do that. You know, they can't go down. That's the whole purpose of it. They cannot go down. That's why they have so many batteries. That's why they have so much diesel fuel. That's why they have the generators. It's there for a purpose.
I think we should have some regulation, like when the utility is at peak time, like some hot summer, extreme cold winter. I mean, the winter probably have no problem. In the like hot summer, when the utility usage is reached at certain point, our system cannot handle. So all the utilities should go for residential first. If this means the data center has to stop running for like certain period of time, let them stop. I mean, can you do some research? Like, is there any cases existing now in other areas, you know, with similar capacity data centers?
I can look into that for you. I think I'll also explore more conversations with Duke to see kind of like exactly maybe when that might happen, what that might look like. I think conversations with them would be good too, because there's also critical infrastructure sometimes when there's brownouts and outages that never go down because they're too vital, they have to stay up. So one question I posed to them, which I'm hoping to get further clarification on, is if a data center is built anywhere in our jurisdiction, where in our jurisdiction might that be a critical area that will never go down? You know, just these kind of things. I'm trying to get more information from Duke, and I think we will. We have a good partnership, and they've been talking to us, but just more questions that need to be asked.
Thank you.
Best practices, again, we've touched on that. We touched on limited timing. Desk separation, that's another thing, encouraging separation distances between the sound generating equipment and the property lines. Encouraging placement behind, principal structures when possible in order to provide extra shielding. And then encouraging the use of parapet walls to screen all rooftop and mounted equipment if it can't be put on the ground and things like that.
And again, I appreciate Director Kin's comment earlier. I just want to emphasize just the encouraging, like what, I don't know, does every encouraging, should I presume it's a shall? Or should I interpret encouraging?
Should it be approved as part of a UDO ordinance or a zoning condition is
Awesome.
a shall, yes. All right, so we're on land use zoning. So zoning, site design.
This is a good point to take another bio break, guys.
Sure,
And I'd like to take about 5 minutes, and then I think we'll come back and then power through and hopefully wrap up by 7:30. My hope. So 5 minutes.
Okay.
Recess till what is it? Yeah, 6:40. Got land use, economic impact, and traffic loss in there. A little shorter than the other ones. So. Yeah.
This is
Yeah, you have more than one shot on this one.
Yeah.
My point is these are things.
We're all trying to help him, Ed. We're trying to help him. I'm not trying to beat up on him. I'm just No, saying, I'm just saying. more than one shot on Yeah, him. we do.
Well, I'm going to take every opportunity I've got.
All right, guys, we're back. We're back on live. We have 3 topics left to go: land use, economic impact, traffic generation. I think they're all a little shorter than what we've been through, so hopefully we'll get you out of here pretty quick. Dig into it.
Let's carry on.
Back
So
to you.
as far as land use goes, so data center zoning varies by jurisdiction. Some require overlay districts with very specific data centers in these specific areas with performance standards. Other jurisdictions might limit them to industrial zones, while others may allow them in both commercial and industrial districts. Something to be aware of. In recent years, related to the noise, architectural design, and specific use standards, some municipalities are amending their current zoning ordinance to attempt to mitigate these, and so they're looking at larger setbacks from like 100 to 1,000 square feet from potential sensitive users, wider buffers to provide some impact resistance for visual impacts and also for noise, and additional screening for electrical and mechanical equipment as well. And it's also exploring increased separation requirements, like we talked about in previous sections for the noise-producing equipment. Additionally, a lot of these larger hyperscale data centers probably need substations on their site in order to power the facility. This will create big, massive visual impact as well, and also potential safety hazards. So we'll just look at that a little bit as well.
Have you done any preliminary work on what an overlay would look like in Apex?
We have not looked at overlays right now, or are we truly considering at the moment, but we can look at all the standards applied to an overlay and bring that back, yeah.
I do like that idea, because a lot of our or what I'm feeling with noise and light pollution and other things, like we already have sections in our UDO that kind of cover that, and so instead of creating a whole net new thing, right, kind of taking the pieces that we already have and using that in an overlay district type use, like, seems maybe more efficient for us to go about. But
sure, we can have continued conversations. Sorry, no.
Sorry. All right.
No, sorry.
I'll gladly take your recommendation on that. Let's put it that way.
Conversations. So the next slide you're going to see here is just an example of a site layout and design. You've seen the physical ones. We've shown you that. I'm going to show you some more pictures, just kind of emphasize what it looks like when they're done. This just breaks it down and kind of explains it to you in case you still had any questions. So we have a server room with all the racks. We can see the backup generators are always located outside. We have heat exchangers on the roof, air conditioning units, backup cooling, and then office area and security, things like that, the site as well. The UPS, we'll just touch on that briefly. That's the uninterrupted power supply. So again, this is like battery backups on site that kick in if there's a disruption in service, but only long enough to get the generators going. These are not designed to carry them through the outage itself. Here's an example of a site layout and design of a data center. I like all the green around it. Another example of the importance of site distance from residential uses. Again, a lot of these examples are coming from Virginia, where for a long time they treated these as essentially office uses. And so they allowed them to be way too close to residential uses, creating all sorts of conditions and issues. And they're actively working on a multi-year process reviewing where they're permitted and what standards they're going to apply as going forward. And they're still in the process of doing that. They'll hopefully be putting out some of their research in the next few months, which we could also provide and look at and give you guys some additional examples. Here is an example of an electrical substation constructed to support data centers. As you can see, they're quite massive. They are quite visually striking. There is high power transmission lines running to them. This case, they're along a road, so really designing where these can go and making sure that there's adequate screening and any type of potential noise mitigation, and also that it's safe on the site as well is important. Another example, this one is a little bit smaller and more adjacent to the site itself, but again, it's a lot of equipment, it's a lot of things to take care of and look at. And in this particular example, you can also see all the coolers on top as well. Look at how many there are. It's quite impressive. That's a data center that's really rocking some computation. All right, so as far as design standards, in this we're talking about, you could have these buildings that are anywhere between 60 to 100 feet tall in some jurisdictions where they don't have design standards like Apex does, addressing fenestration, massing, projections, and things like that. You may end up with these really plain, tall warehouse structures that can kind of age and diminish local character and become visual eyesores if not mitigated. Just as an example, this one, I like the sunset, and honestly, they had some projection here and some more design elements to the site itself. I'm not saying this is the perfect or most beautiful data center, but it is an example of how it might look different than just a plain white facade. So in addition to land use, one thing that's important to consider is that these hyperscales are large investments, and they are developed, they're large projects that are developed on the site. So we talked about it, you'll have your diesel storage, you'll have potentially substations, you'll have massive multiple thousand square foot buildings on site, you'll have cooling towers, all these things. So if something were to happen to the use itself, what happens then? So we're working on requiring decommissioning plans and reuse plans for hyperscale data centers so that future reuse can happen, and that the site itself isn't sitting there waiting for the town to pay for it, remediation and things like that.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Comes up a lot.
Yeah, it's a valid concern. This will be touched on. So some of the things like the removal of the hazards and things like that will be touched on by Chief Herman at your next work session. He'll touch on that specifically, what that looks like and things. So that there, building code has requirements. They'll look at things outside of potentially the hazards. So North Carolina does have codes and regulations for looking at that kind of stuff, and then we'll be looking holistically at the overall designs with the mindset that potential new users could come in. One thing that was brought up that I'll bring into your attention today at the Central Pines Regional Conference, a member of the Department of Environmental Quality mentioned that they required a decommissioning plan for a solar farm. But in addition to that, they also required some type of bonding or financial commitment that also would help with the decommissioning of the site as well. So not just having a nice plot of plans for decommissioning in the future, but also having some kind of collateral built onto it as well, so that the site could be reused. So that's something we'll consider to look into. They just told us about that today, and they offered to provide us information on what that structure looked like as well moving forward. Again, these are all hazards will be looked at. Utility infrastructure could be they could be abandoned. The substation could be abandoned, removed for different users. The new users could come in and want to reuse it as well. But again, we're not recommending, but suggesting we consider decommissioning reuse plans as part of any project moving forward. Some additional considerations. So best practices for data centers, we'll continue to review those, come up with them, including using conditional zoning requirements and development agreements to make sure that we're representing and protecting the community and making sure all impacts are being addressed. Finalizing any amendments to the UDO to create the data center use definition and related supplemental materials that fit our community best. We'll apply the existing standards in Article 9 design standards of our UDO to address, like I said, the architectural concerns and anything related to massing, fenestration, facade, articulation, and materials. And then encouraging maximum height standards or minimum setback distances to really reduce the impact of visual impact from neighboring properties. Again, we're discussing or wanting your input on where these should be located, whether it should be industrial use only or whether they should be permitted in any other type of zoning district. So something for you to consider. Evaluating minimum site area. So whether these are big projects that require a lot of land, do you want to see these come in when they have 100 acres, 200 acres, to ensure that they can meet our extended buffers, our extended setbacks, that they can make sure their substation is far enough off the road. So we could look at and consider requiring a minimum site area to be big enough that there's no potential impacts for them saying, well, I'm constrained by my site and I have to fit it over here on a smaller piece of property, where they'll have to come to us with property that's appropriately sized to be able to do the project.
Do you think that this would fit in well with our 2055 task force that we're working on, or is this more of a separate project? I think the 2055 project.
At the time, I don't think the timing would work out. I think it has to be separate.
Okay.
Is this the time that we talk about what zoning classifications we could explore?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I was going to ask, you've got a couple more slides under land use, but I was just going to ask a question about co-location and rental.
Sure.
And just the responsibility, like if an LLC comes in and builds it and obviously then perhaps has a few of these hyperscalers or a few of these customers in, I know that some of the hyperscalers are intentionally renting so that they don't have the exposure and then the liability that comes along with that. who do we, I guess I would just ask that you folks look into how we would, again, best practices around if somebody comes in, purchases it, and then obviously they just dissolve, right, and they've gone out of business and this thing is sitting there. There's no one to be responsible for it because the company's gone. So that's a big concern, I think.
It would absolutely be a concern because at that point you also have commitments to Duke for Energy and
right. And then this goes to this poor guy lost his job after going on this podcast. This guy on XAI, it just got published today. I don't know anything about it. Could you look into temporary leases as well? Because this is somebody talking about how XAI is building its data center so quickly through temporary licenses. It was the fastest way to get the permitting through and actually start building things. I assume it would be permanent at some point. They talked about it essentially falling under the category of a carnival.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And so again, I want to just make sure, I want to be able to rule it out and say that's something that doesn't
I'm
apply.
pretty sure that's the Nashville example that the Citizen has come and spoke to y'all about. They did things in a temporary way when it should have been done in a permanent way. I might have the city wrong, but there was a Citizen, Memphis, that's it, sorry, Memphis. The Citizen has come, I think it's Glenn Rennie, he's been here a couple times to talk about that. So, I mean, we can look into it more, but yes.
Just to make sure, because
what are you asking? If we would do that? We're not doing that. They can't do that here. Absolutely not. Not under the UDO, they cannot.
So we're able to prevent that entirely.
We are, yes, because of our ordinance.
Boom.
Okay, sorry, I misunderstood your question.
So the co-location, I guess, is the last thing then, since that's alleviated.
And then I would love to know any recommendations you would have for us in the in-between time. So there's going to be new, maybe overlay district or what have you for this. And in between now and then, what happens if we get a permit or an application? What are we supposed to do?
Sure. I mean, I could speak to that now for you just so you have an understanding of the process. So currently, our current UDO gives the planning director the ability to interpret and provide the justification if a use is not listed in the UDO right now. So right now, data centers are not listed there, so that's why there's a potential applicant that's going through the process of amending our UDO to include the data center as a use itself. So right now, all they can do is come in with an application for an amendment or a rezoning, which is the process, current process that's going through right now. So that's where you guys would eventually see it and make your decisions and things like that. So in the meantime, there's not much to do other than have the conversations you're having now so that we can draft the best ordinance and standards to be able to address those if we ever do permit them as part of the UDO as a permitted use, that they're addressing those standards that are now in the UDO from your conversations.
And do we have an anticipated timeline for us to kind of vet it and do it, or a goal that we say, hey, we'll have this overlay district ready by?
We won't be doing an overlay district. It'll be rezoning conditions as part of the rezoning as well as an ordinance. An overlay district is extremely complicated and we would not recommend doing it that way. I already can tell you that. We looked at this during the Western Big Branch Area Plan. The citizens asked for that. It would not be our recommendation to go that route. In terms of what the ordinance ends up like, the ordinance needs to be as restrictive and as tight as we need it to be, because we can never make it more restrictive under current state law. You can only make it less restrictive. And so that's why we are not supposed to talk about anything specific, but that's why we have thought about things to make it limited in location, which you can do. So for example, our downtown festival district, we have made it locational based on a defined meets and bounds description, as well as our central business district, same way. So it may be that we define in a very small area where this is allowed, and then as you get future requests, you can think about whether or not you want to expand it to other areas. But that way you have all the control, and you're not going sideways with the state law, because if you allow it broadly, then you can't restrict it. But if you start very restrictive, you can make it broader as you deem fit.
these are Jonathan's slides. So we're just going to skip past them. All right, economic impact. So we'll start off with employment generation. Significant temporary construction employment is associated with data center development, especially hyperscale data centers. These are usually built in phases, and they're large developments, and so there's probably construction jobs and development going on for many years in a row. But after that, there's usually few permanent positions associated with these data centers. They have what's a pretty big floor to employee ratio. Some hyperscalers that have 250,000 square foot data centers may have a ratio of 5,000 square foot per employee. So there might be only 50 full-time employees on the site at any given time or throughout the process of operation. As far as the jobs go, they're not bad paying jobs. They vary in salary and range here. You can see on the screen. They do exceed the median household income in 2024 for non-family female and non-family male households. So that's something positive going for data centers for sure, is that if you're in this field and you're in a technical field and you work on these kind of things, there could be opportunities for high-paying jobs in this area for you. Tax revenue for real and personal property. Data centers are subject to ad valorem property taxes for real and personal property. So the real being the buildings and the land themselves, and the business property being the equipment inside. So the servers, the graphics processing units, the cooling, all these other things inside that are subject to possible depreciation we'll talk about in a second, but those are the things and how they're separated. The assessments would be conducted by the county tax office. Real property would be per schedule, business property annually during listing cycles. The data provided that we're going to provide is from Wake County for square foot stable for 2016 to 2024, and same for business property values per square foot 2016 to 2024. So using the 2024 assessed values, the average data center had a real value of about $38 million, and where they also had $115 million of personal property subject to depreciation. So it's calculated the value per every $100. So essentially $38 million in real value, you're looking at approximately maybe $135,000 for Apex and tax revenue if based off the 2024 assessed values. For the real business property, the initial might be as high as $409,000, giving you a total of about $500,000 in potential Apex property tax.
And we clarify these numbers a little bit because we're talking about average data centers in Wake County as it stands today. The type of data centers we've been discussing, like larger colo or hyperscale facilities, I'm not aware of any of those being in existence in Wake County, but there are a number of more company-specific data centers. So I think the scale is important here. I have the privilege of working with data centers, and I can tell you that in 900 square feet, I got $30 million worth of equipment in 2 data centers, right? So I just the $150 million personal property valuation seems extremely low, given what I know we can put in a data center, right? And that 30 million is half the rack sitting empty, right? So especially with hyperscalers, these numbers will be much higher than what we are presenting here. So I think the references are important here.
Sure, absolutely. We'll work with other departments to get some more authentic representative numbers to be able to present to you here. This is also just for illustrative purposes.
Understood, but if I just like to be clear on what we're comparing, right, ourselves to.
That's correct. There can be, the size of the data center can absolutely be different, but since this is informational based, we were taking our numbers based off what we're seeing locally in our area. So that's what we're seeing right now in Wake County, but those numbers can change based on the size of the data
And so you and I had a brief conversation during the break. I know there's a 15 megawatt data center in Durham, right? And maybe that might offer a little bit better compare that we can extrapolate from.
Yeah, we can pull that information.
Right, that's a colo facility, so more the kind that we are discussing here.
Yeah, we can do that.
Yes. I also want to point out that since the equipments for data center, those servers, their lifetime is pretty short, like 3 to 5 years, right? Sure. The data center has to constantly swap their equipment. So it's possible that they do not buy those servers. They just rent. If they rent all of those servers equipments, they don't have to pay this portion of the taxes.
Somebody owns it, right?
Hmm?
So somebody owns it.
Yeah.
So like whoever owns the equipment would be on the hook for the tax payments.
So, okay, for example, this end user, right, rented, all these equipments from a company in, for DC. Just give example. So the company in DC has to pay for these property taxes.
That's my understanding.
Is that true?
That's my understanding.
Okay, thank you.
Although, I mean, on this point, one of the concerns that I have is that there might be some sort of regulatory change around this, because we've already seen a regulatory change around sales tax is what it is, right? So it's not unimaginable that in the future, the state may change the laws on how property taxes are calculated for equipment to make it more data center friendly. So just keep that in mind.
And I do want to point out that the state of West Virginia does preempt, and so they have all approval authority, and they collect all the taxes for data centers in that state.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if they were planning on doing that here, I wish we would have known like last week or something. We wouldn't have to be here, right? But and that's also a possibility too. I think I said earlier is there may be, who knows what state laws may be coming. This is such a hot topic, discussed at so much levels. There's so much money involved, so much revenue for the state, for the local municipalities. I mean, you shouldn't assume that the current, regulatory regime is going to stay static.
I touched briefly on just the appreciation of the property inside the facility, the equipment. We've talked to Wake County tax professionals, and they've estimated that approximately within 5 years it could lose about 95% in its value. So say you approved a data center today and you were getting $409,000 of estimated property tax to Apex. In 5 years, if they're not swapping or replacing this with new equipment, the depreciation they could potentially claim you might only get about $20,000, given this example here. So there's a risk. Some more information. Qualifying data centers are exempt from sales tax on electricity and certain support equipment. Other tax exemption incentives for eligible data centers exist under North Carolina but are not available in Wake County. And Apex receives 3.29% of Wake County sales tax collections. All right, traffic generation. This will be our quickest section. Given that there are outside of construction and initial development with construction vehicles and things like that, these do not generate a lot of traffic generation in general. There's minimum employees on site at the time. Typically, there's not a need for lots of deliveries or anything like that, so they're pretty mild when it comes to traffic generation, even at the hyperscale level. These policy and considerations were provided to us by some of our transportation department team. Essentially, what it boils down to is that should a data center come in, we'll look at it how we look at everything by working with NCDOT staff, town staff, the applicant, and their traffic engineers. We'll pursue potential traffic impact assessments and analysis and things like that, and kind of run through the normal process and request any impacts be addressed through the normal processes of review. And again, just more referencing those facts. Okay, so we'll briefly touch on hazards. Again, Fire Chief would speak to this a little bit as well, so we'll just run through these. We've already talked about some of these as well. There's chemical hazards on sites from coolants, refrigerants, biocides, other things like that. There's also the potential for fire and explosion hazards with its stored diesel, and if they're implementing any type of on-site battery backups as well. Briefly just touch on the battery energy storage systems, or BESS. This is still kind of, for some developers, this is still a really big cost and outside of what they're willing to do in a lot of areas, but there have been developments that do implement these, and so just wanted to make you aware in case you guys move forward and do decide to allow data centers in our jurisdiction that potentially you could see this type of thing come along with them. And so essentially what this is, These battery energy storage facilities are these containers that are lined up with different types of batteries, whether they be lithium ion, lead acid, sodium ion, or other types of batteries. The operator will either generate the energy via solar or something else on site with on-site generation, or they will buy power at non-peak hours, store the energy, and use the energy later on. So one thing to be aware of with these is that lithium ion specifically, batteries in general have hazards such as thermal runaway. So essentially what that is if there's overheating of battery cells, it'll trigger essentially a self-sustaining chemical reaction, and it'll just get hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter, and eventually you have the risk of fire and explosion. And if you have a lot of these together, very dangerous. They're hard to put out. With responding, you don't want to use water and electrical fire. You have to use different methods and things like that. And so you make sure that your emergency services are prepared to address these things.
I know you're in the flow here, but I think we're roughly at the stopping point that we talked about earlier.
We can stop here and we can
We
continue.
had our public safety people coming to our next
Sure.
week's work session, and we're going to pick up the presentation, the last couple sections there, and it'll be available to stream. Planning board, you guys are welcome to join us or to watch online, but in order to let our staff and everyone go home, it's after 7 o'clock. We've been here for almost 4 hours. Thought this was a good place to end.
Sure.
We good?
Yes.
All right, so thank you very much for all the presentation, all the information provided today. And I think, in interest of getting out of here, if we can get email to us a general idea what the follow-up would be when we'll hear back again what the next steps are for this process. I know you may not know right now, but let us know what to expect next and when.
Absolutely.
We'll look for it. We'll inform the public. Sound good?
Sound good.
All right, we are adjourned. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, right.
Thank you, sir. You're welcome. Nice to meet you, Mary.
Can't believe we ended before 8.